Netanyahu walked into the emergency press hall as if the world still bowed to him. Cameras flashed, advisors whispered, and yet his eyes darted, searching, calculating, nervous. He tried to hide it behind a smirk, but the tension on his jaw exposed him. Moments later, the room fell into a stunned silence as Ibrahim Traoré entered. No entourage. No hesitation. Just presence, raw, unshakable, warrior still. Netanyahu barked first, his voice cracking like an old whip, "Africa is nothing." The phrase echoed in the hall, cold and arrogant. His followers nodded in forced approval, but even they felt the discomfort ripple through the room. Because the moment Netanyahu spoke, Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't even shift his weight. Instead, he looked at Netanyahu as if examining a spoiled fruit. Then he stepped forward, and the temperature in the hall changed. Traoré's calm voice cut sharper than any shout. "If Africa is nothing, then why do you fear us?" The cameras froze. Netanyahu's smirk twitched, collapsing into a stiff half-frown. Every journalist felt it. This was not politics. This was a man confronting another man with the truth he had spent his entire career avoiding. Traoré continued, his tone steady, almost surgical. "You fear Africa because you cannot control it anymore. You fear me because I speak for a generation you forgot existed." Netanyahu attempted to interrupt, but Traoré simply raised his hand. The Israeli leader stopped mid-breath, not because he wanted to, but because Traoré's authority filled the room like a storm front. Every flash of the camera caught Netanyahu shrinking inch by inch, while Traoré grew in stature without taking a single step. This was the shift. The moment where the bully met the warrior. The moment the rehearsed smirk met a man who didn't play by his script. Traoré leaned in slightly, just enough to make Netanyahu swallow hard. "You call Africa nothing," he said, "because the truth scares you. The truth that Africa rises. And your threats? They fall." The hall didn't erupt. It didn't need to. Silence was the applause. Traoré turned away, leaving Netanyahu frozen, hands trembling behind the podium, realizing that for the first time, he was the one being confronted with power he couldn't intimidate. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't even bother to correct Netanyahu's tone. Instead, he let the silence stretch, long enough for every camera to zoom in, long enough for every delegate to notice the tremor in Netanyahu's jaw. The Israeli Prime Minister had expected outrage, anger, defensiveness. He got none of it. What he got was something far more dangerous, calm. Traoré leaned forward slowly, elbows resting on the table, like a general who already knew how the battle would end before it even began. "If Africa is a nothing," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the room, "then why does your entire government stay awake at night thinking about us?" Netanyahu's smirk froze. The hall went still. Even the translators hesitated before speaking, as if the truth needed a moment to settle on everyone's shoulders. "You talk about Africa," Traoré continued, "the way frightened men talk about storms, loudly, hoping the noise will hide their fear. But storms don't change their path because someone shouts." He paused, gaze steady. "And neither do we." A murmur rippled through the room, not applause, not shock, but recognition. People could sense it. Traoré wasn't responding to an insult. He was exposing it. He was turning Netanyahu's own sentence into a mirror, forcing him to look at himself. Netanyahu tried to speak, but Traoré kept going. "You bomb cities and call it defense. You silence children and call it security. You take land and call it survival. Yet you look at Africa, standing on its feet, rebuilding its power, and suddenly you remember the meaning of fear." The lights overhead reflected off Traoré's uniform as he leaned back again, perfectly composed. It was the posture of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to win. A man who had already won. Then he delivered the line that left the entire hall breathless. "If we were truly nothing, you wouldn't be talking about us. You wouldn't be warning us. And you definitely wouldn't be trembling, right now, behind that smile." Netanyahu's fingers tightened around his pen. Cameras flashed. Delegates exchanged glances. Everyone could see it now. Africa was not nothing. Africa was rising. And Netanyahu had just admitted it, without saying a word. The room tensed the moment Netanyahu leaned back in his chair, a smirk cutting across his face like a knife. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every syllable. Africa is nothing, he repeated, louder this time, making sure every diplomat heard him. A few heads lowered, not out of agreement, but out of second-hand embarrassment. Everyone knew the statement was reckless. Everyone knew he had just poked the wrong man. Traoré didn't blink. He didn't even shift his stance. He simply exhaled, as if Netanyahu were a child throwing stones at a mountain, believing he could move it. The Burkinabe leader stepped forward, boots echoing across the marble floor, each step stronger than the last. Then he stopped, right where Netanyahu would be forced to look up at him. "If Africa is nothing," Traoré said, voice low and steady, "why does your voice shake every time you speak about us?" A hush fell instantly. Netanyahu's smirk trembled. Cameras zoomed in. A few pens stopped moving mid-sentence. Traoré hadn't shouted. He didn't need to. His words carried the weight of centuries. The stolen minerals, the stolen lives, the stolen futures now returning like a storm. Netanyahu opened his mouth to respond, but Traoré cut him off with a raised hand. Not aggressively, just enough to say, "Your era is over." "You bomb children and call it power," Traoré continued. "We protect ours and call it duty. That is why you fear us. That is why you will always fear us." Behind him, African delegates straightened their backs, emboldened. Even leaders who usually avoided confrontation nodded subtly, as though witnessing the shift of a global axis. Netanyahu swallowed hard, realizing too late that he had not humiliated Traoré. He had activated him. Traoré leaned closer, eyes sharp enough to cut steel. "You can erase maps," he said, "but you'll never erase the people who drew them." Silence. Then whispers. Then the unmistakable realization spreading through the hall. Netanyahu had tried to belittle a nation. Traoré had answered as an entire continent. The room fell into a heavier silence as Traoré leaned forward, elbows on the table, gaze sharp enough to slice through Netanyahu's arrogance. Cameras zoomed in, analysts froze their commentary, and even the diplomats pretending to check their phones subtly looked up. Something was about to break, and it wasn't Traoré. "Let me remind you of something," Traoré said calmly, his tone almost surgical. "Empires don't fall when the weak rise. They fall when the powerful rot from within." Netanyahu scoffed, rolling his eyes, but the tremor in his fingertips betrayed him. Traoré saw it. Everyone saw it. "You say Africa is nothing," Traoré continued. "But Africa doesn't run from battles. Africa doesn't hide behind walls. Africa doesn't bomb children to feel strong." A few diplomats inhaled sharply, even the Israeli delegation stiffened. Netanyahu snapped, "We fight terrorists." Traoré didn't even blink. "You fight shadows. And somehow the shadows you fight are always children, always mothers. Always the defenseless." His voice deepened. "If that is your definition of war, then maybe Africa should teach you what a warrior actually looks like." Every word landed like a blow. Netanyahu's jaw tightened, but Traoré wasn't finished, not even close. "You fear us," Traoré said. "Not because Africa is nothing, but because Africa is no longer silent. And a continent that refuses to kneel is more dangerous to you than any army." The room pulsed with tension, the kind that could only come from truth spoken too loudly in the presence of those who tried to bury it. "Now," Traoré concluded, leaning back with a quiet confidence, "tell me again, why do you fear us?" The room fell into a cold, brittle silence as Traoré leaned forward, elbows resting confidently on the polished table, eyes fixed on Netanyahu with the kind of steady intensity that made even seasoned diplomats shift in their seats. Everyone expected Traoré to lash out or raise his voice after the Israeli leader's insult, but instead, he smiled. A slow, deliberate, unsettling smile that told the entire hall he was about to take the narrative and crush it piece by piece. "Benjamin," Traoré began, his tone calm enough to make the silence feel heavy. "You say Africa is nothing. Yet for a man who claims it means nothing, you speak of us too often, and fear us even more. A murmur rippled across the room, journalists whispering, cameras zooming in, aides nervously adjusting their earpieces. Netanyahu stiffened, but Traoré didn't give him a moment to regain control. You built your empire on taking. Africa built ours on surviving. One of those lasts longer. His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. It was the kind of tone that held weight because truth carried it. Netanyahu's jaw tightened. His aides signaled for him to respond, but his hands remained clenched, his rehearsed confidence suddenly slipping. Traoré caught it instantly. Look at you, Traoré said softly, almost pitying. Your bombs, your armies, your threats, yet a single African voice shakes you. Why? He leaned back, giving Netanyahu the room he knew he didn't want. Because deep down, you understand something your arrogance can't hide. Africa is no longer silent, and you know you cannot silence us. The Israeli delegation froze. The American observers exchanged uneasy glances. Even the UN moderator looked like he was witnessing something historical unfold. Netanyahu opened his mouth to retort, but Traoré's next line landed first, sharp as a blade. You fear Africa because you can no longer control it, and the moment a man fears what he cannot control, he starts to crumble. Netanyahu's face twitched, the first real crack in his facade. Cameras flashed wildly, capturing every second, Traoré towering without ever leaving his chair. This wasn't just a political clash. It was a global shift, spoken into existence. The hall went still after Traoré's defiant words, but Netanyahu wasn't finished. He leaned forward, voice sharpening as he attempted one more blow. Africa talks big, he spat, but power belongs to those who strike first. For a second, cameras zoomed in on Traoré's face, expecting anger. Instead, he laughed, quietly at first, then with the steady confidence of a man who had already survived every threat thrown at him. His shoulders didn't tense, his eyes didn't shift. He simply stood there like a wall carved from iron. Power? Traoré said. If bombing children makes you powerful, then you're weaker than you think. The room shook, not from noise, but from the stunned silence that followed. Netanyahu blinked, visibly thrown off balance. No advisor, no soldier, no politician had ever spoken to him this way. Especially not someone he had just dismissed as nothing. Traoré continued walking toward him, each step deliberate, as if measuring the ground between two worlds, one built on domination, the other rising from resistance. You fear Africa, he said softly, almost calmly, because Africa is not afraid of you. That's the difference. Netanyahu attempted to hold his posture, but the shift in the room was undeniable. Diplomats turned, reporters scribbled faster, even security detail exchanged glances. Traoré's presence wasn't just bold. It was destabilizing. And let me tell you something else, Traoré added. You can bark at nations, threaten borders, destroy cities, but you cannot kill the truth. And the truth is standing in front of you right now. Every word landed like a hammer on cracked stone. Netanyahu opened his mouth, but for the first time, no sound came out. Sit with that, Traoré said. You claim Africa is nothing, yet you tremble every time we speak. The cameras caught everything. Netanyahu's tightening jaw, his clenched hands, the flicker of uncertainty he couldn't hide anymore. And just like that, the power dynamic flipped. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The hall's silence tightened around him as he leaned forward, elbows on the table, speaking with the calm of a man who'd already survived everything his enemies feared. Netanyahu, he said, his tone almost gentle, you keep calling Africa nothing. Yet every move you make tells me Africa keeps you awake at night. Netanyahu's jaw tensed. He opened his mouth to respond, but Traoré didn't give him the chance. If Africa were nothing, he continued, you wouldn't send drones over our airspace. You wouldn't beg for alliances disguised as demands. And you wouldn't tremble every time we say a word you don't like. A few diplomats shifted uncomfortably. They could feel it, the shift of power, the swing of momentum. Traoré wasn't just answering an insult, he was flipping the entire table of global politics. He extended his hand across the polished UN desk, palm up, offering Netanyahu a look that was part challenge, part truth serum. You fear what you can't control. Africa is no longer controlled. Netanyahu tried to laugh, but it came out thin, almost hollow. Traoré saw it. Everyone saw it. And Traoré pressed harder. You claim Africa is a nothing, yet you fight nations smaller than our provinces. You bomb children because you know you can't win against real warriors. A murmur rippled through the room. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Netanyahu's smirk had evaporated completely. Traoré didn't break eye contact. If Africa were nothing, he said slowly, you wouldn't be sweating right now. Netanyahu touched his forehead instinctively, realizing too late that yes, there was sweat. And the whole world had just watched him wipe it away. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't even shift his weight. Instead, he stepped closer, so close that Netanyahu's security instinctively moved, hands twitching toward their earpieces. But Netanyahu lifted a shaky palm, signaling them to stop. He didn't want the world to see him hiding behind bodyguards, not while still pretending Africa was nothing. Traoré's voice dropped, calm but cold, dangerously cold. Tell me, Netanyahu, he said, if Africa is nothing. Why does your entire intelligence network monitor every meeting we hold? Why does Mossad track every alliance we form? Why do your ministers panic every time Africa speaks with one voice? Netanyahu opened his mouth, but Traoré cut him off with a raised finger. No. Don't answer. I already know. The room fell so silent that the hum of the air conditioner sounded like thunder. Because Africa rising, Traoré continued, means your era of intimidation dies. It means your bombs no longer silence the weak. It means the world finally sees who the real threat is. A murmur spread across the delegates, dozens of leaders shifting uncomfortably, realizing Traoré wasn't just speaking to Netanyahu. He was speaking to every nation that had treated Africa like a pawn. Netanyahu's jaw clenched. He tried to regain the upper hand. You speak boldly, he hissed, but bold words don't win wars. Traoré smiled. Dangerously slow, like someone who had already calculated the outcome. That's exactly why you fear us, he answered. Because we don't fight wars with words. We fight them with unity, strategy, and truth. And truth is something your government cannot outrun forever. A camera clicked. Another recorded. Millions would soon watch this moment. Traoré stepped back, giving Netanyahu one final sentence, sharp enough to cut through every lie on the global stage. You're terrified, he said softly, because Africa isn't kneeling anymore. And when the people you stepped on stop kneeling, they rise. Traoré's words didn't fade, they spread, echoing from delegation to delegation like a quiet rebellion. Netanyahu felt the shift in the room immediately. The cameras caught it too, diplomats leaning forward, African leaders nodding sharply, even European representatives exchanging uneasy glances. Something had changed. A soldier had spoken, and the world was listening in a way they never listened to him. Netanyahu tried to recover, slamming his hand on the table. Africa is irrelevant, he barked. We shape the world order. Not you. But the outburst only exposed his panic. The microphones picked up the tremble in his voice. Even his advisors stiffened, they knew Traoré had already won the psychological battle. Traoré rose slowly, deliberately, like a man who didn't need volume to dominate a room. Tell me something, he said, his tone steady as steel. If Africa is nothing, why does your voice shake every time you say its name? A murmur rippled across the hall. Netanyahu blinked, once, twice, caught between anger and disbelief. Traoré stepped closer, closing the distance with the calm confidence of a soldier who had survived battlefields Netanyahu would never dare to step on. You fear Africa because you can't control it anymore, Traoré continued. You fear African unity. You fear African strength. And you fear African truth. Netanyahu tried to interrupt, but Traoré didn't let him. You fear that the world is finally asking the question you've avoided for decades: why are you bombing children? Why does your security always begin with burying the innocent? The hall fell silent, painfully, uncomfortably silent. Cameras zoomed in on Netanyahu's clenched jaw, his narrowing eyes, his trembling breath. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Africa is not nothing, he said. Africa is your mirror. And today, you don't like what you see. That line hit like a hammer. Delegates looked away from Netanyahu, ashamed or unwilling to be associated with his collapsing narrative. Traoré stood tall, unmoving, a symbol of a continent that refused to kneel. Then, with a final chilling calmness, Traoré added, "Maybe that's why you fear us. Because Africa rises, and your lies fall." The room shook as Traoré stepped forward, not with rage, but with a terrifying calm that made every diplomat freeze. Netanyahu, who had spent the entire summit posturing and barking threats, suddenly found himself staring at a man who did not flinch, did not blink, and did not fear him. Cameras zoomed in instinctively, every viewer could feel that something irreversible was about to happen. Traoré's voice dropped to a controlled whisper, the kind that cuts deeper than shouting. "You want to know why Africa frightens you?" he said, eyes locked on Netanyahu. "Because you cannot threaten a people who have already survived everything your world tried to destroy." Netanyahu stiffened, jaw twitching. He opened his mouth to respond, but Traoré didn't let him. "You claim Africa is nothing," he continued. "But you keep watching us. You keep fearing us. You keep calling us into rooms like this because deep down you know the truth: we are becoming something you cannot control." Several leaders shifted in their chairs, trying, and failing, to hide their reactions. The tension felt physical, almost visible, thick enough to choke the silence. Traoré took one more deliberate step forward. "You bomb children," he said. "And call it security. You steal land and call it history. You ignite wars and call it survival. But when Africa rises, you call it a threat." Netanyahu stood frozen, breathing through his nose, unable to interrupt. "That is why you fear us," Traoré said, voice turning sharp as steel. "Because Africa does not bow. Not to kings. Not to empires. And definitely not to men who hide behind armies." The room erupted, some in shock, some in applause, and some simply unable to look away. Netanyahu lowered his gaze, completely silent for the first time since the summit began. Traoré didn't sit back down. He didn't need to. He had already won.